our third day of the Inequality Week. So this week has been developed by Unit G4 with the great help of all the thematic units, as Unit L3 being part of it. So today and this afternoon, it's a session dedicating on reducing inequalities for food security and nutrition organized by Unit L3. I will be the facilitator of this session. So you may know me. My name is Mathilde Cournu, working at Unit G4 on inequalities. So thank you so much for being here with us this afternoon. This afternoon's session will be about discussing the issues of income and other aspects of inequalities within food and nutrition systems. To begin this session, we will have an introduction and overview made by Leonard Mizzi, head of Unit L3. After that, we have the chance that 4 guest speakers will present their experience. I would like to welcome Nadine Mbasso, Director of Food Systems Coordination, IFAD, Nick Nisbet, Senior Research Fellow at Institute of Development Studies, currently member of expert team working on LHP report, Elizabeth Nsimadala, President of the Eastern Africa Farmers Federation, and finally, Pedro Campo Llopis, Head of Cooperation from the EU delegation at Cabo Verde. After the intervention of our guest speakers, we will open the floor for a Q&A session answered by our guest speakers and Unit L3. Housepage chat box, in the Housepage chat box, you will be able to find the link in the Zoom chat box. Sorry, you will be able to find the link to the Housepage platform where you can ask all your questions, which will be answered at the end of the presentation. Do not hesitate to ask a question and also to put your camera on. It's always nice to see some familiar faces and to make this session as interactive and lively as possible. After this Q&A, we have the great chance to have Philippe Latriche, advisor on inequalities, for the closing remarks. Without any delay, I would like to lay the floor to Leonard Mizzi, so head of Unit L3, for the introduction. Leonard, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mathilde, and thanks first of all to all the team behind the Inequalities Week, Directorate G, especially my team and my sector lead, so Elena and her team, and also Laura, who deals also with gender transformative approaches. Clearly, we can't discuss inequalities in a broad sense if we don't also look into food and nutrition security. We have experienced a period of 3 years, which are quite, I would say, dramatic, quite eventful. COVID pandemic is probably we're just getting gradually out. But we also have the aggression of Russia on Ukraine impacting one of the critical sectors, as we know, being food. With the weaponization of food, you probably have been reading the headlines. Luckily, the Black Sea Grain Initiative was just extended a few days ago. But again, the war is there, it is protracted, it's still happening. And as long as the war continues, we know that the impact on grains, on fertilizers, will have and is having a major impact on livelihoods, on small farm holders. And this is what we are trying to elaborate on in the presentation and with the speakers ahead. Next slide. So I don't need to give you the headlines. The numbers are pretty striking. We have 3.1 billion of people across the globe that still can't afford a healthy diet. These are data sets from the World Health Organization 2020. Again, 2020 baselines does not fully factor COVID and the war. The numbers will unfortunately risk being much higher when we come to report 2022-2023 baselines. We have a number of what we call the perfect storm, but it's more than a storm or a tsunami. It is the impact of food, the impact of energy, the impact of the pandemic, climate, conflict. We don't need to read the media headlines every day on conflict-ridden hotspots across the globe. So indebtedness, debt distress, macroeconomic shocks, all culminating, and we as international development community and donors need to help governments, to help societies to mitigate these shocks and to have an inequality lens in our interventions. Clearly, the global food crisis has deep structural inequalities. We don't need to enter into the details, but clearly, when we speak about land rights, around access to finance, clearly the issue of access to finance to women, to young people, to those who are landless, to indigenous populations, this is clearly a number of multiple shocks impacting societies. SDG2 cannot be achieved without addressing the drivers of inequality. And here we need to go and look at the root causes, because our interventions need to be targeted to also have a gender lens, a youth lens, but also a rights-based approach in our interventions. Next slide. So here we have some basic concepts around inequalities, and it's important to clarify these basic concepts. I know that Nick will elaborate, because this has been the baseline of the high-level panel of experts on inequalities and FSN outcomes. Inequalities in the food systems include inequalities facing producers. Elizabeth, as a woman leader in Eastern Africa, will elaborate on this. It also has an impact on micro and small and medium-sized enterprises, of which farmers, cooperatives, small cooperatives are at the core of the value chain. Also, in terms of access to resources, whether we speak about finance, about natural resources, access to water. We are in the middle of the UN Water Conference. Water is a key aspect in the agri-food systems, both in terms of food loss and waste, but also in terms of production systems, irrigation systems, and lack or not lack of water resources in production systems. Transparency of markets. And we speak about one tool we have, which is the Agricultural Market Information System. But how easy is market information on, for example, cereal markets, fertilizer markets? How does it distill? We speak about mobile telephony, access to the digital agenda, but are there any gaps in terms of access to data sets which impinge upon market transparency? We know that the longer is the value chain, the more complicated it is for the weakest link of the value chain being usually the farmer, the woman-led organization, including also at local, regional, or international markets. We can't also forget consumers. There is clearly a consumer, rural-urban consumer divide, but also what can consumers, even in urban settings, what can they afford? This is also an issue which is also discussed in EU member states and in the OECD developed countries. How does food inflation impact purchasing power, access also to a healthy diet? So this is something that I think is important, because it's not a question of having a diet, but how can you afford a healthy diet, which, as you know, is also based on a balanced diet, including fruit and vegetables and access to seasonal products. Next slide. What is our strategic approach? Clearly, we want, and this is now more and more the way of addressing food systems, is having a sustainable and equitable food systems transformation process. This comes from the UN Food Systems Summit of 2021. We are now heading into the stocktake of the UN Food Systems Summit, and I know that this will also be elaborated in more detail by Nadine, because this is at the core of the delivery of what we are trying to do as international donor community in terms of landing on a human rights-based approach at country level, So 2021 baseline with a country pathways, and then how are we going to help countries? We just had a discussion today on Bhutan, pretty much maybe an outlier country because it's very small, but clearly also a country which is under climate change shocks, under water stress, under productivity issues, under access to finance, around youth, around gender. So this is also a process that we have to go at the granular level in order to address inequalities in a rights-based approach, in a gender transformative approach, looking as well into unsustainable production practices, looking at value chains where we look at food loss and waste. We see how markets are functioning, how transmission mechanisms are functioning. So also to have a multi-stakeholder approach in the decision-making process. One of the pleas in our daily context, whether it's a G7, G20 multilateral forum, is that civil society organizations, NGOs, small private sector, farmer organizations want us to help them to be part of the decision-making process also, because that is also a way to address inequalities in how decisions are taken. Clearly, where you have strong governance structures embedded in an interministerial with strong political buy-in, clearly the advances on inequalities in value chains are more visible than those where you don't have these governance structures. So this is also a role for the donor community to enhance that multi-stakeholder approach, but also inclusiveness in decision-making processes. Next slide. So this is just an example which are pretty proud of. Clearly, we still work on it. It's not an easy process, and it is very targeted. We speak about here what is known as the Sustainable Cocoa Initiative, whereas you know the European Union is a leader in terms, not only we have just had the decisions of the institutions on the deforestation regulation. We have a baseline of a living income differential in Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, but also Cameroon is involved as well. And here it is a model which tackles rural inequality, looks also into child labor, looks into the dynamics also of schooling, of access to education, but also in terms of livelihoods, in terms of addressing climate change and biodiversity. This is the key objective of the Sustainable Cocoa Initiative, and it will be clearly the process where we unfold the discussions around deforestation-free value chains, starting with cocoa, but clearly this could also be emulated and advanced and applied to other commodities, including, for example, coffee. What are we trying to do here? This initiative clearly has the buy-in also of the main industrial partners. It is an initiative which ensures a decent living income for farmers, tackles social and environmental challenges, but also supporting a process to enhance living incomes for cocoa farmers, which is a sine qua non for sustainable cocoa production. Also, to support an economic pact on sustainable cocoa, where we need all the partners in the value chain. Now, this is a challenge for any value chain, whether it's cocoa or coffee or livestock. When you speak about agropastoralism, looking into tensions between herdsmen, landowners, and also conflict around natural resources, it is this way that has to be a more holistic way. The cocoa initiative could be a baseline for other initiatives also to enhance the quality of diets, but also to support child and maternal health. Next slide. Another example is the work that we do in the Sahel. Clearly, one of the biggest hotspots we have. What we have been doing for the period 21-24 is that the EU has set aside around 0.7 billion between 21-24 in 7 countries, these being Burkina, Cameroon, Chad, Mali, Mauritania, Niger, and Nigeria. As we know, this is a conflict-ridden zone, which is also under shock from an economic point of view, skyrocketing food and energy prices, and clearly climate change, where at least 195 million of people are in food crisis or worse in 2021. We'll have the new data sets in a month's time, and that this has been a 25% increase from 2020 baselines, and it is clearly getting worse and worse. Tackling inequality is a driver of food and nutrition crisis, which is at the heart of the region. Reducing inequalities is essential to build the resilience in the face of multiple crises. And clearly here, the focus has to be on children, which make about half of the population in the Sahel, and they are clearly more vulnerable and are suffering more from hunger than adults, because it is more difficult for them to adapt to the challenging circumstances. We are financing a range of actions, including budget support to accelerate job creation, identifying those value chains which have traction, but also which give opportunity to young people to invest, including in sustainable agri-food systems, of which agroecology is a model that we are scaling up in a number of Sahelian countries. Next slide. Clearly, we need to do more, and accelerating on what the experiences and what the impacts and delivery are showing. We want to, and this is something that Philippe will elaborate on, as INTPA, we want to mainstream inequality focus through the introduction of the inequality marker, and we will continue clearly supporting the CFS, which is the Committee on World Food Security, which is the primary and probably the only platform involving civil society, involving private sector, and building up on the outcomes of the report on reducing inequalities for food security. The consultations are ongoing, but the CFS, and through the UN Food System Summit, and through the Global Network on Food Crisis, that is the network of networks between the FAO, WFP, the US, the World Bank, and other players, we want to go as granular as possible and have also an inequality lens in our interventions, especially around youth, around children, and around women in our interventions. Thank you, Matilda.
Thank you, Leonard. Thank you so much for presenting your strategic framework and your action, and also insisting on the fact that we cannot have a distinguished agenda when talking about nutrition, food security, and inequality. Tackling inequality is a driver for promoting a sustainable food system. Without any more time, I would like to give the floor to our first speaker, Nadine Ngbosa from IFAD. Please, Nadine.
Yes, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good afternoon all. And I think Leonard already came up with a kind of very strong introduction on and mentioning food systems several times. So my task today is to speak to you about food system transformation, the food system agenda, and the issue of equity and sustainability. How can we ensure that the food system transformation lead to an agenda of equity and sustainability? So let me start by reminding ourselves, what do we talk about when it comes to food systems? Food system is the way we produce, we basically process, distribute, prepare, and consume the food. So it's all the activities and elements related to that, whether you talk about infrastructures, whether you talk about industries, whether you talk about agriculture. But what the food system is also looking at is basically what are the outcomes, what are the impact of the food systems in terms of, for example, socio-economic or environmental aspect. And this is where it directly links to the equity and sustainability agenda. I think you all know today, and Leonard alluded to it, and it was very clear actually, that food systems today are being challenged. This is why you had a food system summit in 2021, and that now we have actually the food system summit follow-up which is now being called by the Secretary General for July. Let me try to look at the food system from the equity and sustainability lens, as has been asked to do today. Food systems are challenged, if I can say, in 3 of the basic functions. You agree that the first function of food system is to provide food and good nutritious food to all. And I think it is quite clear that the number of hungry people, like Leonard has mentioned, has been increased for the past 3 years. So basically, the food system are now in a situation where we are not feeding the world population and the numbers are increasing anymore. People are used to seeing figures about Africa and Asia, 40%, which as having the largest share of hungry and people in the world facing malnutrition issue. And the population, they affect about 1 in 5 people, for example, in the Africa region. But what people are less used to know is that food insecurity is also growing in Northern America and in Europe, which are regions of the world which had not seen this situation before. Again, as Leonard mentioned, one of the triggers was the COVID-19 crisis and the cost of living crisis that everybody's talking about. And now we see that hunger affects 8% of the population in Northern America and in Europe. And you see the figure for France and Canada. So food systems is not become a southern issue anymore, but it has basically become a global challenge as the way climate can be seen today. When I bring this home to the livelihood and inequity issue, you have to know that primary agriculture is the basis of food system. To process, to transport, you first need to produce it. And 90% of the farms today in the world are basically smallholder farms of less than 2 hectares. And in terms of inequity, you have to know that 2/3 of the people living in extreme poverty are the smallholders and the agri-food workers. So here the emphasis on smallholders, and this figure I'm giving you about the percentage of smallholders is not for the South, it's globally. In the whole world, 90% are smallholders. But when you get deeper into equity, you realize that the food system issue is really deep, because the food industry today is estimated as about 10 to 12 trillions a year. It's the biggest employment sector. It is a lot of money. We were with the Rabobank today. They said the money is there because you have a market of over 8 billion people to feed. But what is important is that this food industry does not distribute equitably benefits it generates. As I mentioned, the smallholders producing the food or the agri-food workers are the majority of the poor in the world. And this income inequality and inadequate social protection means that millions of them are going hungry and are unable to afford a healthy diet. And women are challenged across the whole food system because as primary producer, on average, 40% of the producers are women. In some countries, it's up to 70% that production is led by women. They are also a large share of the employee of the agri-food business, and they are the anchor of household nutrition. So they are basically affected in all the facets of the food system on this inequality. Finally, linking that to sustainability, we have to know that food system is one of the biggest green gas emission emitter, with 1/3 of the green gas emission coming from food system, responsible for 80% of biodiversity loss and 70% of fresh water use. When we talk, Leonard spoke again about the water issue recently. So we know that without food system transformation, for example, the climate agreements are unattainable, knowing that this is where the green gas emissions are coming from. And this is also why we talk about rescuing the Secretary General, rescuing the SDG by looking at food system in terms of sustainability and in terms of equity. What are we doing about it? I'm from IFAD, and IFAD and the World Bank have been asked to lead a financing agenda for food system transformation, basically looking at 2 things that was discussed during the summit. It is assessed that about 300 to 350 billion a year are needed to address the issues I mentioned to you, and that financing also need to be provided differently. And what do we mean by financing differently? First of all, to recognize that the 300 to 350 billions a year are not to be seen as an addition, but it's something that is feasible. It's 0.5 of the global GDP. OECD and emerging economies spend about 500 to 700 billion a year on agricultural subsidies, which have a distorting effect. and could be redirected. Or, as I mentioned, the value of the food industry is between 10 to 12 trillion. So it's nothing compared to what is needed to transform food systems toward more sustainability, equity, and resilience. The second thing, what do we mean by financing differently that was defined by the Food System Summit? Is the number one is that the public resource and incentives must finance food systems that are not unhealthy, destructive, or unsustainable for the planet. So this means looking at the way domestic resources are allocated in developed and developing countries to ensure that allocation are prioritized despite the challenging context, and that the subsidies and incentives are conducive of sustainability. For development partners in terms of ODA, it's stepping up investment, but also looking at the coherence of this investment, knowing that, as I mentioned, a lot of this investment are distorting measures which have a depressing effect on the competitivity of smallholders, which, as I said, are the most affected by the inequitable food systems. We also have to look at the decision the food businesses are doing, that they do not harm the health, the environment, and the well-being, simply because we had a study by the World Benchmarking Alliance showing that 93% of the food businesses in the world, the major one, do not have green gas emission target, do not work on accessibility of nutritious food, about 80%, and 90%, while they are the biggest employment sector, do not have targets on improving wages and incomes of the agri-food workers. So it means that this requires specific attention in looking at the sustainability and equity agenda when there's a call for incentivizing the private sector investment. Finally, something also that is important is that the financial instruments must be fit to address this and also deal with primary producers. You have to know that there's no evidence that private sector investment lead directly to an impact on the sustainable development agenda, equity, or sustainability goals. You need to link that with target. It's not that the private sector doesn't want, but there's no target that has been linked and measured on how they impact on inequity and sustainability. Also, we must ensure that the financing rebalance bargaining power is towards fair prices and living wage for the agri-food workers, and also to more affordability of healthy diets. And that's the foundation basically to ensure that the stability and resilience towards which investments have to go. And I think the Ukraine war has shown that enough. So basically, looking at the food system, the issue is to move from food security only focus to ensure that the way we produce and the food access to food is sustainable, ensure decent livelihood and equitable incomes, and buildings resilience. I will say that the work we are doing here is to create a dynamic to make sure that the investment go towards this objective. And the number one is basically to ensure that we don't only focus on agricultural protection, but that there's coherence between the different sectors of the food systems, that we are also dealing with different interests and value group. You know, when you increase, for example, the price or the incentive for the producers, it defeats the purpose for the consumers. Or when you have subsidies in the north, it defeats what's happening in the south. So we are really dealing with complexity and a system approach that one has to look at. And then I will also finish by saying that in order to finance better, we need to know what's happening in the financing of food system, who spends what, how much, where, for what purpose, what are the gaps and needs, so that basically we ensure that it targets the sector and the people most in need and deal with the issue. And this is why IFAD and the World Bank are working on a tool to help countries measure their financing to food systems and where are the gaps in need, and also working with OECD to measure ODA to food system to make sure that it goes in the right place and in the right countries. We must also trigger a dialogue on subsidies and incentives in the South and in the North, and on the private sector on the quality of the investment. I will finish by saying that you see with that food system is not looking only at one dimension or at food security, but we need to look at the emergency today without forgetting the future and making sure that sustainability and equity is built in the agenda. And Mathilde, I apologize for being very fast because I'm waiting at another meeting with the Office of the Secretary General, which started 2 minutes ago. Over for me.
Thank you so much, Nadine. Thank you so much for your presentation, for discussing the issues of inequality within food system in terms of production, distribution, access, and also the transformation needed for an inclusive and sustainable food system transformation, especially in terms of investment coherence, efforts, business model adaptation, etc. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time, and good luck for your other meeting. And now I would like to give the floor to Nick Nisbet, so Senior Research Fellow at Institute of Development Studies. Nick, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Sorry, I'm just struggling a bit with the screen sharing, but I will be there shortly. No, my apologies. Yeah, I can see the window open, but it's not allowing me to share it just this minute.
I can share it for you, Nick, if you wish so.
Yeah, just let me start presenting.
I think you can see.
You can see this now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. So thank you. That was an excellent presentation, and it was lovely to hear from Leonard's views of internal approach of the EC as well. So I'm going to be talking about work that fed into the Global Nutrition Report 2020, and that is now also feeding into this Committee on Food Security high-level panel of experts on reducing inequalities for food security and nutrition that Leonard also mentioned. So firstly, why a focus on food security and nutrition now? Social and economic inequity has always been associated with nutrition outcomes. And in some countries, the gap is actually widening. So this is data we put together for the Global Nutrition Report that shows the countries with the gaps that are increasing the most and the gaps that are narrowing the most. And you'll see here that the gaps are actually widening in some quite important populous countries, including Nigeria. But within country inequalities are also shaped by social position. Here, for example, is Vietnam, where work by the National Institute of Nutrition shows how stunting rates differ significantly, not only by subnational region, but also by ethnicity. And in other countries, other forms of deprivation have also been shown to be strongly associated with food and nutrition outcomes. So here in the UK, we use an index of multiple deprivation, and this adds health, employment, education, and other indicators of deprivation to income. And you can see how this is strongly associated with poor food outcomes, in this case, obesity amongst primary school aged children. As Leonard said, on top of this, we've got COVID contributing to the largest single year increase in global hunger in decades, and we still don't know the full extent of this impact. And this combines with the conflict in Ukraine and other drivers of food price rises to push more people into the poverty food insecurity cycle. So it's expected that these newer pressures will not only drive food insecurity, but are also going to push many more millions of people into poverty, exacerbating the cycle of poverty, inequity, hunger, and malnutrition. It's just worth remembering that poor diets are now the leading cause of ill health and death around the world, costing the world an estimated $3.5 trillion and impacting some African economies by an estimated 16% of GDP. The HLP report also covers multiple other inequalities. We see inequalities in land access, financial access, workers' rights, monopolistic concentration in the food and the seed and input sectors. And so these are the data that have kind of formed the background to the HLP report. But on top of this, we know that climate change will only exacerbate existing inequalities and vulnerabilities. And we're lucky to have the IPCC AR6 report just published this week. Then the text from the left is from that report, which mentions that in rural areas, vulnerability will be heightened by high resilience on climate sensitive livelihoods. vulnerability of ecosystems will be strongly influenced by past, present, and future patterns of unsustainable consumption and production. And the report particularly singles out the agri-food sector for not only for contribution to that unsustainable consumption and production, but also a sector that will be deeply impacted by these climate vulnerabilities. So these are the data that led us to put together a new framework for the Global Nutrition Report in 2020, and that is now being further developed by the HLPE report. This drew on some earlier frameworks, so many people here will be familiar with the UNICEF framework on the causes of malnutrition and death amongst mothers and children, but we also drew on the work of the World Health Organization Commission on Social Determinants of Health. Beyond that, we also drew on broader feminist and political philosophy ideas about justice and equity. And these ask questions of fairness, so who gains and who loses, not only in terms of resources, but also the costs and benefits of policy decisions. Justice, how do we recognize how unfairness builds up over time and whose experience comes to count in these dominant societal institutions? And because of this, who is included and represented in decision-making, so inclusion there as well. So this is how our framework developed. So we started off by looking at inequalities in nutrition outcomes, and underpinning these outcomes are people's experience of their immediate food, health, and care environments. And these are conditioned in turn by their own daily living conditions and their behaviours and practices. And these are all issues which are fairly well known and researched and acted on in work on nutrition and food security. For example, we know that adults living on a low income, in an insecure job and surrounded by poor food environments are unlikely to have the resources to follow optimal dietary recommendations for themselves and those in their care. So underlying these factors are people's social position. So this includes income inequalities, but it also includes factors such as gender, caste, ethnicity, age, disability, etc. And these also impact and interact with the human, personal or group resources that they have to draw on in any given context and which accrue over multiple generations. Underpinning these levels of social stratification are the cultural ideas, norms, and values such as gender, for example, which shape who is placed higher or lower in the social hierarchy. And these then crystallize into the institutions and other societal structures which help to govern society. So this is the kind of system as it exists in a solid state. And in an equitable system, resources and capital would be allocated fairly according to need. And key actors and their ideas would uphold this through informal and formal institutions. And everyone would have access to optimal food, care, and health environments. But of course, we're here because it doesn't work like this. So we put what we call the engine of inequity at the center of this, describing these processes of intergenerational and interterritorial injustice, unfairness, and exclusion, which help drive these processes of inequality from the structural determinants through to the eventual outcomes in terms of food and nutrition outcomes. And here's just a kind of slightly nicer version of the framework that we used in our paper. So these ideas have been brought forward into the HLPE report, and I was really pleased to see Leonard present some work based on that report earlier. So a group of experts have been working on this report since last June. The team is led by Bhavani Shankar, includes myself, Jane Battersby, Jodie Harris, Christina Hicks, Marielena Humbachano, Shweta Manohar, and it's coordinated by a secretariat in the CFS. Version 0 of the report was launched last year, and that was open to public consultation, and we were really pleased to see comments there from commission experts and people in delegations. And as Leonard presented, we've kind of, one of the things that we've put forward in this report is a new framework which tries to connect the systemic drivers of inequity with the downstream kind of impacts of that in terms of food and nutrition outcomes. So to structure the report, we use the HLPE food systems diagram, and I was really pleased to see the last speaker speak about the kind of systemic perspective because we use this throughout the reports. So we look at impacts within country and between country in terms of food nutrition outcomes, but we also look at some of the systemic drivers of that, including things like climate change, sociocultural drivers, governance and politics. The report looks at actions that have to be undertaken within the food system, but also transformative actions outside of the food system, which might be applied with a food and nutrition equity sensitive lens, including actions such as social protection. And then the report ends with a call for transformative action in the food system, not least because we're seeing increasingly that globally we're far off to meet targets within the SDGs, also set by the World Health Association, or World Health Assembly, sorry, and also climate-driven targets. So the report calls for transformative action in food systems and nutrition based on this equity basis. So the report will be launched in June, and we're hoping that it might be of use to stakeholders, including the EC and your delegations. So that's it from me, and thanks very much. I'm looking forward to the other presentations and questions.
Thank you very much for this excellent presentation and for discussing the key messaging emerging from the LHCP report regarding the key drivers and priorities of fighting inequality within the food system and nutrition. And also for your insight from the nutrition equity framework, very interesting. So happy to discuss that during the Q&A session. And please, participant, if you have any question you would like to ask to Nick and to the future guest speaker, do not hesitate to write them in our space platform. I would like now to give the floor to Elizabeth. So President of the Eastern Africa Farmers Federation, very happy to have you here. Elizabeth, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Matilda, for giving me this opportunity. And let me start by appreciating the EU for inviting me on behalf of my fellow smallholder farmers to bring our voice to this Inequalities Week, and most especially in this session on reducing inequalities for food security and nutrition. Of course, we all know that smallholder farmers also fall under the disadvantaged category when it comes to inequalities in the food systems. So I'll straight away go to the next slide. The structure of my presentation will be a brief introduction of my organization, the Eastern Africa Farmers Federation, and then I'll give insights from an African perspective regarding the inequalities, looking at income, gender, and land with respect to food systems. Then I'll also highlight the challenges that we face as a federation and some of the success stories that have been generated, and wrap it up with a conclusion. So next slide. Next slide is on is our structure as an organization. We are a regional organization operating in the 10 Eastern African countries. And our purpose of formation was to really facilitate the regional integration process. And our membership are food producers, those in crop, in livestock, in fisheries, but also in the agro-forestry. Our vision is really to have a prosperous and cohesive farming community in the Eastern Africa, currently in 10 countries representing 24 national level apex organizations. And these are from producer cooperatives, commodity associations, from women and youth organizations, from lobby and advocacy based organization. Next slide. So I'll not go into the self-introduction. I'm a Ugandan farmer and smallholder agripreneur from Western Uganda. So I would like to straight away go to the strategic direction of EAF. So at EAF, we have a new strategic plan, 2021-2028, that really focuses on transforming smallholder agriculture into rewarding investments. And we have a specific component that looks at economic services and also has a specific focus on membership capacity strengthening and spotlighting youth and women to create affirmative action and really address the inequalities along the agricultural value chain. So in terms of the next slide, in terms of the insights from an African perspective regarding the inequalities in respect to the food systems, I think this has really been touched on by all the previous speakers, Leonard, Nadine, and Nick, and especially Nadine really explained the food system. And as we all know, the system is like a value chain. All actors in their interactions along the food chain form what we call the food system. So when it comes to the inequalities, I think for me, the first a strong point that I would put forward is in reference to governance. When you look at the governance across the entire food system, it's really riddled with serious inequalities. Nick, I think it's Nick who really touched on a lot on the balance of power, which tilts towards the actors, especially high up the food system. But also when you look at the trade rules and market access, the rules are also not relenting. And that's why, for example, the World Trade Organization rules do not, I would say, do not favor really the African actors. And one reason I would give is, for example, when you look at all the ACP countries, they can cumulatively export about 20 billion USD worth of coffee. But only one country, Germany, can re-export 80 billion US dollar worth of coffee from the same coffee season. So again, in terms of the gender engagement and access to resources, when you look at all these inequalities in governance, in market access, in rules of engagement, all these piggyback to affect the downstream incomes, the gender engagement and access to resources, including land, when you talk of capital, when you talk of labor, all these are really affected by these inequalities. So until we address these upper end of the food system inequalities, all these other that I would call the siloed interventions, trying to address the inequalities are just a lip service, and they are not sustainable. And I would say that's really no wonder we have little or no traction over the years we have really intervened. Next slide. So in terms of highlighting on the challenges faced by EF as an institution and some of the stories that we've generated, we've had an experience when it comes to our strategic focus on engaging farmers as key actors along the agriculture value chains, and our work on the East Africa Cooperative Societies Bill. And as farmers, we pushed forward this bill as a private members bill through the regional parliament in order to address the inequalities that exist around regional trade. So as a federation, we executed this initiative to really strengthen the engagement of our farmers as key food system actors through influencing this regional policy to promote the formalization of aggregation as a concept and scaling it beyond regional level, because we believe in cooperatives, in farmers associations as special purpose vehicles to create and transform our food systems. But the results are that the policy processes are very frustrating at times, because this is a law that was passed by the regional parliament 8 years, I think 7 to 8 years ago. But till to date, it still awaits the presidential assent by each of the East Africa Community partner states. So, and when you try to follow up on what really is the reason for not assenting to the bill, and no reason can be given. Also, when it comes to our experience with the digitization, we also operationalize the digital platform to actualize the power of aggregation in use. And this was really to empower the farmers to improve on decision making, to, to enhance operational efficiency, to try and mitigate and adapt to climate change and form mutual relationships also with other actors. For some of you who can maybe Google the e-granary, this is a farmer-led digital innovation that really aggregates farmers for markets, looking at both the input market, the service markets, and also the output market. The digital platform was able to prove that farmers have the ability to tilt the balance of food systems and can be a key player if well supported. We can address the inequalities by simply aggregating our numbers and generating our own data to influence a positive business case in our favor. But also our work in supporting youth and women initiatives has also depicted inequalities as a result of gender, the education levels, where men tend to have more opportunities than women across the entire value chains. And also when you look at the educated and the less educated, you realize that the more you're educated, the more opportunities, in the food systems. Next slide. So in terms of what I would look at create mutual partnerships between the different actors. I think Lena really on the importance of having mutual partnerships as we are looking at producers, the private sector. These partnerships should be for ensuring that we have the right policies, not only stopping at the right policies, but also the right implementation mechanism of these policies and the investment infrastructure to address some of these inequalities. We also need to increase and support programs that address gender inequalities. Most countries have affirmative action programs, but these affirmative action programs are very short term and they're really not sustainable. Next slide. So in terms of what I would touch on, the key things that I would touch on as part of my conclusion is on the that is really needed. We really need to see a lot of heavy lifting to try to convene and retain relationships with the different actors. The relationships must be mutual. There has to be someone willing to really take lead in convening others, because we know it's really an expensive process and a very engaging process to try and convene partnerships. Sorry. We need to look at the issue of trust, because we know that for partnerships to work, there must be trust among the different partners. There's also need for capacity strengthening to build the farmer cohesive numbers, and we can use these numbers to really transform the respective food systems using the bottom-up approach. And lastly, there's also a need to invest in the required resources to really address the inequalities. And this should be accessible regardless of sex, regardless of gender, regardless of class, and regardless of education. With that, I thank you for now and look forward to the next set of questions. Thank you, and over to you, Matilda.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Thank you so much for being here with us. It was an excellent presentation. It was also a great opportunity to better know your organization, your structure, your challenging success, And it's also your focus on membership capacity strengthening, youth and women initiative, and also digitalization. And I think you raised a subject that was also discussed in other session that we organized this week regarding data generation. It's something very common regarding inequalities. So thank you again for your insight regarding inequalities with respect to food system, and highlight that inequality is multidimensional. So it's important to also take into consideration the gender aspect, income aspect, land, etc. So thank you so much. Please, participant, if you have any question to Elizabeth, so we will answer that after our last presentation. Do not hesitate to drop them in the Our Space platform, and you can find the link of Our Space in the Zoom chat. Pedro, thank you so much for being here with us. So Pedro is a head of cooperation at the delegation, the EU delegation of Cabo Verde. It's a very a pleasure to have Pedro here. So Pedro, without further notice, the floor is yours. Pedro, you are muted. You are still muted. Maybe Stella, could you unmute Pedro?
I asked him to unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes, we can. Perfect.
Okay. And can you see the presentation? I'm not sure you can see it.
And we can see the presentation.
Okay, good. Okay. Yeah. So, so here it is. Let me see. Can you see full screen or just the slides? I cannot really sure what you're saying now. It's okay. Yeah.
We see it in slide view, so you should have to click on presenter mode.
Yeah. Let me see slideshow. Yeah, I think it's good now, right?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, thank you very much. So thanks, I mean, for this opportunity. I think what is important, obviously, when we try to tackle one main global challenge and development challenge, is to identify the problem and the needs, and I think that's critical. And academia and members of international organizations are fundamental to try to focus and to bring in the arguments for why this is a relevant problem, why we should focus on it. But there's another side of the problem is that when you're confronted with a budget, you're responsible for a budget of cooperation in one particular country, you also need to answer the question of how do I tackle that problem? I mean, what are the instruments that I have to actually address this challenge? Very often, when you look at these challenges, and we saw the presentations beforehand, it looks overwhelming. It looks something beyond our scope or our capacity to actually respond, because we have to be realistic, and what we do with development cooperation funding, it's only a marginal contribution to the national budgets. So we have to be very strategic and really think what is it that we can actually change and transform. And I think that'll be my presentation will revolve about this idea, you know, how from the larger and broader problem, what is it that can you do with the limited resources that you have in a context that is where you are an actor among others, and where you cannot tackle the problem by funding, you know, responses itself, but it's also about trying to bring in reforms and changes through dialogue with government and other stakeholders, civil society and others. So I will start by trying to give an overview first of you know, of Africa, because obviously Cabo Verde is a country in West Africa, but I think it's good to understand and to have a better understanding of which are all the actual challenges that we are facing in the continent. So it has been already repeated that inequality undermines growth efforts to end poverty, so it exacerbates food insecurity and malnutrition. And it's a driver, obviously, of political instability and insecurity. We all know that. But I think when we see and we look into Africa, we realize that the problem is extremely acute in the context of sub-Saharan Africa. As I have some figures here that I think help to understand the real challenge. You know, six billionaires in Africa have more than 50%, have as much as 50% of the poorest population in Africa, and 80% of the population lives on less than $5.5 a day, which also means they are unable to afford a healthy diet. In the case of 12 countries in particular, 90% of the population is unable to afford this healthy diet. And Africa is the only region in the world where a trend which we thought after the MDGs in 2015, we thought it will be reversed, but it's actually not the case. So the number of malnourished children is actually rising in the context of Africa, which is also, I think, an indirect indicator of growing inequalities. This is a very simple scheme, but I think it's important to recall what are the interactions between nutrition and nutrition inequality and growth. So, as you know, poor nutrition hampers the cognitive and the physical development of children, and these conditions they learn throughout their lives, their professional lives. So children with are suffering for poor nutrition will perform in school with low performance. Will have a very poor performance in school, which will hamper their social mobility. Obviously, they will have less chances than other students of their same generation, and this will have an impact in inequality because obviously they will be less capable of finding opportunities to have benefit from social mobility, and they will stay as their fathers poor. This, in exchange, will prevent them from, as they grow adults and they themselves have children, to provide proper nutrition to their children. So it's a vicious circle that repeats itself. On the other hand, poor nutrition also, as I said, it limits the cognitive and individual physical development. That has an impact in productivity of the workforce, which also limits economic growth. And again, lack of economic growth is lack of opportunities, including for the poorest. So it also affects, once again, poor nutrition. So this vicious circle has to be challenged and has to be broken in order not only for to address the case of nutrition, but also to address the challenges of inequality and poor growth performance in countries in Africa. The case of Cabo Verde, I think, is very telling. It's small countries, you know, on the West African archipelago. And Cabo Verde, until the COVID crisis, had been an example of human development, reduction of poverty, economic performance. It was a reference for many countries in Africa, of a country that, despite the lack of natural resources, was really able to stick its head out and perform as one of the most advanced countries in sub-Saharan Africa. However, the latest data on equality, which started to be measured in the last 2 decades or so, showed that this growth, this economic growth and performance, had also a consequence in increasing the gap between rich and poor, and that there had to be something done about making the growth more inclusive, because we know that growth by itself doesn't automatically result in more equality, or doesn't benefit all in the same way. So clearly there was an issue of people being left behind that the good growth performance was not able to tackle. Also, there was a problem of vulnerability. Cabo Verde is a country that, due to its lack of resources, depends much on external factors. It depends enormously on tourism, and tourism flows determine very much the performance of the economy. So when there is a crisis that limits tourism, like COVID-19, the results are catastrophic. In 2020, the GDP of Cabo Verde dropped by 14% only a year. So that gives you a measure of the dependence of Cabo Verde on external shocks. Even prior to COVID, there was still a large significant part of the population that couldn't afford a healthy diet. And as the country was recovering from COVID, we had the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which generated a new crisis, like food price crisis, in a country that imports 100% of its cereals. It doesn't produce almost any agricultural products, and certainly not cereals, which is a staple food of the poor across the world. So as a result of the price crisis in the first semester of 2022, we went from a situation of relative food security to a situation of where up to 10% of the population was facing an acute deterioration in food security. And these indicators, I think, tell us on food security and nutrition they are a good proxy of understanding the inequality gap in countries. And I think that's demonstrated by the fact that in the case of Cabo Verde, most of the people who suffer from food insecurity are also the people which are extreme poor, which may seem obvious, but it's something interesting to understand that the correlation is very close and that we can use sometime one or the other figure as proxy of the other. But again, going back to the challenge that we're facing when you are in a EU delegation managing a budget, you cannot tackle all the dimensions of inequality. You cannot tackle all the problems. You have to address many different challenges, and you have very limited resources, especially compared to the national GDP or the national budget. So you need to prioritize, and you need to try to understand where can you actually bring change and where can you actually do something that is transformation. In the case of Cabo Verde, we decided in 2021 to focus on extreme poverty. And why? First of all, of course, because it was one of the dimensions of inequality that was more acute. You know, the fact that still in a country like Cabo Verde, that is lower middle income country, still we have a significant part of the population in extreme poverty. And of course, inequality is not only an issue of reducing poverty, it's also a question of reducing the gap between rich and poor. Lifting poor of their situation, especially the extreme poor, has obviously an enormous contribution to reduce that gap between income levels. And why extreme poverty? Because the government in 2021 committed to eradicate extreme poverty by 2026, so 4 years before the SDG deadline established by the globally by the international community. And in the case of Cabo Verde, this meant people living under $1.9 a day, which amounts to 13% of the population in the figure that we have from 2020. So the idea was to use our most powerful tool to bring change into policies, which is by its support. As you know, by its support is a mechanism through which the European Union funds provides funding for the treasury against a number of performance indicators, which are related to policies which are existing but have to emphasize accelerated or have to be more focused. So the idea was to help the government create a social safety net to actually ensure that nobody in Cabo Verde was living below the extreme poverty line. So to lift everybody above the line of $1.9 a day. Why was that the focus? Because we have defended that the multiplying effect of increasing income at those very low levels of income, it's enormous. It opens a number of opportunities for populations that see their income doubled in terms of more capacities, more opportunities, from access to health of isolated populations to the school performance of children, because they have a better diet, to access to job opportunities, training, etc. It liberates time, it liberates potential for the poorest to actually access the opportunities that are offered by other public policies. In the case of Cabo Verde, we decided to support the strengthening of two pillars and the creation of a new pillar to fight extreme poverty. Trying to be very realistic about what were the actual elements that needed to change, the actual policies that could be implemented to achieve a goal that sometimes seems a bit beyond reach, but which is in the case of Cabo Verde, we think it's really within reach, even by 2026, if the government commits sufficient energy and resources. So the first thing you need to do when you're trying to tackle extreme poverty is to try to know who are the extreme poor, why are they extreme poor, and which are the conditions where they are, what are the challenges they are facing. So a social registry nationwide was created. It covers right now 90% of the poor of the country, and it gives you a pretty good idea of the situation of each of the households suffering from extreme poverty. They have 56 criteria. We're trying to add new criteria, which could also include the quality of the diet and other elements which I think are critical. But this social registry, it's the first step and the fundamental step for a government that wants to take seriously extreme poverty reduction to be effective. Second thing was the creation of a cash transfer system that is institutionalized and transparent and known by the public. So this rendimiento social de inclusión, social inclusion income, that will be translation, was created by law. It defines exactly the amount of money that has to be received by each of the households, which households of this national registry, social registry, can benefit, and for which period. So it's pretty protected from political manipulation. It's pretty protected from lack of transparency, from nepotism and other potential risk of transferring cash to the poor, and it's a pretty solid and transparent system. But the third element, and I think is the biggest challenge when we're working in development cooperation, is that we tend to think or we tend to fund policies that exist as long as the funding is there. So once the donor stops funding, the whole thing collapses, and that's one of the biggest frustrations of anybody working in development. So one of the things we try to push forward when we negotiate with government is that there had to be additional fiscal resources generated to fund this policy, in particular of extreme poverty reduction. It could not be funded on loans or grants from donors in the medium term. There had to be some sort of national funding that would guarantee the sustainability of the policy throughout time, and not only up to 2026, but also beyond that year. So in 2022, last year, a new law was passed to create this social fund, which interestingly, it will be funded through an increase in the tourism levy that tourists pay when they come to Cabo Verde. So which are mainly European tourists. So part of what they pay daily as tourism fee now goes to feed this fund that goes by law directly to support social transfers for the extreme poor under the conditions explained above. So it's pretty, again, transparent, and it provides a source of funding that is extra budgetary. So it adds up to the budget of the government. So it was easy to convince the Minister of Finance to accept this because it gives him more leverage and resources, and it helps to actually provide a level of flexibility for the government, because this tourism levy can be increased. In fact, in Cabo Verde, it's not very high. It can be increased as needed, and then so that it can feed on this fund that can also be used to cover a significant part of the extreme poor. Eventually, by 2026, it will be 100% of the extreme poor. Another challenge that we're facing is the moralization of poverty, as I call it. This idea that by providing cash transfers without conditionality, money is spent irresponsibly, money is used for something else, and that the actual needs of the poor, and that money is not used for nutrition, for example. That by giving transfers, you create also dependency. So we had the government do a very interesting study where they analyzed how these transfers were used by the poor. And I think what was very telling, as you can see in the graph in the slide, is that 72% of the funding was going to food. And why is that? I mean, there's a simple explanation. 80% of the extreme poor in Cabo Verde are single-headed, single mothers that are running their household alone. Most of them with children. 38% of the extreme poor are children in Cabo Verde. And I think this is almost a universal pattern. Women with children tend to invest first in their children. They don't spend the money in spurious expenditure. They go to the basic needs, the same needs that we have identified as critical. So the graphs show that despite all the prejudice, as I say, moralization of the poor are not fit to make good decisions about how they spend money. The study that was made demonstrated that actually the poor was spending first of all in food for their children, that, as we saw before, has an enormous impact on their nutrition levels, their performance in school, and social mobility. So in the case of Cabo Verde, there is clearly no need to condition the cash transfers. They are effective per se, basically because they go and they are managed mainly by woman-headed households. And I think that's an important note to understand when we design these policies. So I will conclude with a number of three main conclusions that I think are critical. First of all, is that malnutrition can be tackled by ensuring people can afford healthy diet. This is a very simple statement, but I think it's very important that we all understand that. I said partially because it's not only about being able to afford the diet. There has to be also availability of food. There has to be other elements. There has to be a level also of education so that the diet is appropriate. It's not just food that they're buying, but good quality food, nutritious food. But that dimension of ensuring that people can afford diet is fundamental. And for that, you can do many things in policy, but one of the critical things is to make sure people have the sufficient income to afford that diet, especially when you're talking about women taking the decisions about the use of this funding. The second element that I think is important is that no matter what we do when we operate in a particular country through various programs, one of the important things that we need to do, and one of the things that the European Union can do through budget support, this very important tool that we have in most of the countries, is that we can influence public policy. And at the end of the day, in the medium term, is the public policy, the transformational policies that will solve the problem of malnutrition and inequalities and reaching that gap, especially for the lowest quintiles of the population, the poorest part of the population. And it's not unique to Cabo Verde. Depending on different countries, you can find solutions to finance through donor contributions in the initial phases, then through national resources, these policies. And some would argue that the poorest country have no fiscal margin of maneuver, no fiscal space to actually fund the policies, but they do. I think in every single country we can find source of funding, even new source of fiscal policies, by, for example, taxing the tourist, taxing the richest, and they can be discretionary, they can be permanent and structural, but there are always ways to raise more funds to fund these policies. And I think one of the challenges we have is we don't understand sufficiently how governments operate. We don't start sufficiently the fiscal structure of governments, and we don't understand sufficiently what are the options and the opportunities for governments to do part of the job. So as I said, we can start out with budget support with policies that are funded by donors, but in the medium term, we have to identify those new sources of funding so that the government can fund the policies themselves, which is the only way to make these policies sustainable in the long run. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pedro. Thank you very much for your time and for your very interesting presentation. It was great to have your perspective from the EU delegation on strengthening programming to reduce inequality, and also your insight regarding the role of public policy in reducing inequalities and poverty. You really make the link between one of the last sessions we have on fiscal policies and the need to increase fiscal revenue to fund inequality reduction policies. And also the next session we'll have tomorrow on social protection. As you say, and you prioritize, it's not possible to tackle every dimension of inequality. We need to focus on some aspect, especially when we have some limited budget and resources. And the fact that you have decided to tackle extreme poverty through social safety nets is something we can definitely also talk during the next session on the social protection tomorrow afternoon. So thank you so much again. And now I think it's time for our great Q&A. I see in the Housebase platform that we have 3 questions, and great, because we have 1 question per guest speaker. So I will start with the question for the first guest speaker. So Nick, in the chat, of course, I congratulate you for your presentation. Indeed, it was very interesting. And so one of our participants would like to know more about the equity dimension you have presented, and if you can share with us a case study where this dimension was used.
Thank you, and thanks also for the last presentation, which I found fascinating. And I agree that social protection absolutely needs to be part of the picture. But on the equity dimension, so yeah, this is a new framework. So it's been used, as I said, in the Global Nutrition Report, but it's been used more recently, for example, to examine food environments of indigenous people in Australia. And it's been kind of used in other research contexts. I think in a policy context, I think it's a little bit early to think about whether this framework is being used, but I think the best example historically of a country that's combined all these factors might be Brazil, where you see redistribution or fairness combined with recognition of structural inequities, which is justice, and also real attempts to improve governance and inclusion. So the success there has been quite well documented in both the food and nutrition fields. Obviously, there's been some setbacks over the last decade or so. But I think this is a country where we can look to further progress in these areas in future, particularly given the change of government recently.
Thank you very much, Nick. And your point made me think about an initiative that we are currently managed from the INTPA headquarters from the unit G4, the research facility on inequality that is implemented by IFD and which is also considering several aspects of inequality through a research perspective. And they have conducted a diagnostic on Brazil. So maybe there is also some discussion that we can continue further. For Elizabeth. Great. For Elizabeth, a question for you. How do you think to organize the partnership, having a voice to all of them, and particularly the most vulnerables?
Yeah, thank you very much, Matilda. And I want to appreciate the guest who has asked this particular question. From our point of view, I would like to start by saying that it's actually not something that we are thinking of doing, but it is something that we are already doing. Because we believe in working in an ecosystem way, where, first of all, we had to profile all the key actors across the agriculture value chain, and most especially the enterprises that we are dealing in as a farmer organization. And like I said, for a partnership to work, there has to be someone who is willing to take lead in convening others. Otherwise, if you leave it as no one's business, then nobody will take it up. So we really took a lead role in identifying some of the partners that we really needed to work with. Currently, we have more than 20 partners that we are working with, and these are across the entire value chain. For example, I mentioned about the e-granary initiative that we are implementing, which really looks at the input market, the service market, and the output market. So when it comes to the input market, we identified those that are in input markets, those in fertilizer, those in certified seed. When it comes to services, the financial partners, the insurance service providers, those that are in the logistics area, those that are into irrigation, into transport, into agro-processing. And also when it comes to the output market, the off-takers, the different off-takers. And then we had to organize a series of meetings, at first to introduce ourselves, but also we packaged well the work that we are doing for them to appreciate the importance of being in this mutual partnership with us as a farmer organization. And it's all built around trust. Once each partner is able to trust each other in the value chain, then things get moving in a very smooth way. So I think it's important when you're doing this kind of work that you really try to identify those key partners that you really want to work with. And then, like I mentioned, a series of meetings we are organizing, business-to-business meetings, where we've been inviting our member cooperatives and farmers associations to showcase what they're doing within their cooperatives, but also be able to strike some of the business deals within most of these business-to-business meetings. Thank you, and over.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for sharing this practical experience, and also insisting on the challenge of sometimes targeting, identifying the partners, and that made me think also of one of the challenges that Pedro mentioned during his presentation. We will continue discussing about this difficulty of targeting the most vulnerable in the last day of the Inequality Week, during which we will present you one tool that we are developing at INTPA's distributional impact assessment. So a tool which helps us ex ante and ex post to identify the most vulnerable. So during the design and the formulation phases. To all speakers, I will have another question asked by a participant, and I will read it. With the limited fiscal space, what would you say would be the #1 policy tool for reducing inequality in nutrition? Difficult question. I don't know if Pedro, Nick, Elizabeth, Leonard, you would like to intervene?
I can comment on that if you want with a very quick answer. Obviously, I mean, I just presented what we decided to cover, so I will obviously defend my decision. But I would say that you know, that the transfer of fiscal revenue, especially if you create extraordinary sources of fiscal revenue to tackle the dimension where inequality, I think, has more acute impact on individuals, which is extreme poverty, makes a lot of sense, especially if you have very limited resources. So obviously, depending on the country, this can be a large number of people. So you may need even to focus with the extreme poor to specific groups. But I think that addressing, lifting the income of that lowest quintile of population has a lot of potential. Also because the multiplying factor, the multiplying effect in very low incomes is bigger than in, you know, lower or middle incomes, if you want. So, you know, by doubling the income of somebody which is earning only $2 a day, you will have more impact than if you double it for somebody that earns $5 a day or $10 a day. So the cost effectiveness of your intervention will be high. But of course, there can be other issues. And well, and lastly, the link with nutrition, as I said, is not the only dimension for malnutrition, but affording a good diet. It's one of the first things that people need to have. I mean, it's not so much about patronizing and telling people what they need to do, is to give them the means to actually do it, which is, you know, buying a quality diet that is affordable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pedro. Leonard, do you want to come in?
Thanks. Clearly, you have to put all the instruments available to the government. It's a very tough political decision on what is the best instrument. And for us, budget support, productive safety nets are clearly preferred options. There are also a number of coalitions in the UN Food System Summit which prefer or push certain initiatives. We speak also school meals could be a way forward. Has also to be specific, context specific. Clearly, a country like Cabo Verde and a country like Brazil are very different. Brazil was mentioned, but we also know that COVID and food price inflation, what's happening in Argentina with stagflation of 100%, is clearly creating havoc on inequality. So we will have an EU Latin American summit, and clearly inequalities is at the core of the debate, because the situation in 2022-2023 for countries like Argentina and Brazil is clearly critical. You can't have a cohesive Latin American continent if you don't address inequalities. Clearly very specific, and I think even in our work on UN Food System Summit, what Nadim mentioned, repurposing of smart subsidies is important. We didn't enter, Elizabeth knows a bit what's happening on the fertilizer market. So you have those pushing for more subsidies on synthetic fertilizers, more debt. We have problems, major problems on corporate governance of how subsidies are managed. We're not saying no to synthetic fertilizers, but we're saying smarter targeting of fertilizers on soil maps, and also weaning the small farm holders away from a high dependence which public policies can't afford forever and ever. The case of Malawi being always cited, where you have a high cost operation with limited returns even on maize production, for example. So it's very specific to the countries, to the policies, and now the big word which is being said in World Bank, OECD, in international fora is repurposing of subsidies and better targeting of smarter subsidies, and also green finance also enters into the equation, as long again as it is not greenwashing. So this is a bit of a complex equation, but clearly I would say productive safety nets would be one of the best options.
Thank you very much, Leona, for presenting this very complex equation and also taking into account the country's specificities. Very good to have some country-specific examples. Coming back to Pedro, so in the in-house there is a question regarding a presentation. Can you please put a link to the study that showed that women spend most money on food? Just would like to remind that all the presentations of the guest speakers will be published in the House-based platform after the session.
Yes, but I will do that, and I can also share the government report. It's in Portuguese, so hopefully the graphs are easy to understand. So I think that will be a challenge.
Perfect. Thank you so much, and happy to also publish the report in our space. I can see that there is another question to all speakers. Food producers are actually part of the private sector, so they do have a key role in making nutritious food available, or in the contrary, putting in the market food of low nutritional quality, junk food, which are very often at a low price and thus more affordable for the poorest and most vulnerable ones. How do you think, from your perspective, you can influence the private sector and work with them to reduce these inequalities toward access to good quality nutrition food? Very good question. Very good, complex one, the role of the private sector. I don't know if Nick, Leonard, Elena, Elizabeth,
yes,
please.
Yes, let me start. Before I address this, I wanted to point out on one of the policy tools, really something that is very key and I was not pointed out is on information gathering and dissemination tool. And this really brings us to the aspect of the importance of data. I think when it comes to nutrition, there's need to have real-time data. We've heard about, of course, that there's always these changing pandemics that affect the food systems, but also that affect the nutrition. So we really need to have real-time data so that it can also inform the kind of interventions, whether it is short-term or medium-term or long-term. Then back to this question on the private sector and the role of private sector in providing nutritious food, but also in some cases where it is also possible to to put on the market food that is not very fit, I would say, for human consumption, not, let's say, not nutritious. And I really want to touch on what has already been said on the inequalities in the food systems. When you look at the current food systems, and I think every speaker has pointed this out, it's really not balanced at all. The food systems are unfair. There's no one who is willing to pay for the true value of the food, be it the consumer, be it any other actor across the entire value chain. The food systems are not inclusive at all. They are not just. They are imbalanced. When you look at the benefits and the losses that are within the value chain, they are imbalanced in a way that it's only those who are higher in the value chain that normally benefit from the food system, leaving out the smallholder farmers who are at the production end. So I think there is the need to really recognize the importance that smallholder farmers play in food systems, especially as the stewards of earth, because for us we view agriculture, we view food systems as a source of our livelihoods, as a source of our economies, as our day-to-day work. So we invest a lot into the food systems in making sure that they are sustainable. But we are not getting rewarded for the work that we are doing for that. So can we have a true value for food? Everyone is demanding for nutritious diets, but are they ready in return to pay for that health, for that nutritious diet that they are demanding from this smallholder farmers? And not until we balance that power, then I think there will always be those imbalances. Thank you, and over.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for this intervention. I don't know if anyone would like to jump in. Nick.
Yes, I just wanted to add a little bit on food environments. So we know from the global literature that there's relatively low cost interventions that are looking at the kind of, the retail environment, the marketing, promotion, advertising environment, particularly around unhealthy foods, but also thinking about how to promote healthier foods, particularly more fruit and veg interventions. So these are kind of relatively low cost interventions. There's also examples of taxation of sugar sweetened beverages that seem to have worked very well actually in the countries that have implemented them. Front of package schemes, a lot of examples now from Latin America. But there's also a broader argument for the redirection of subsidies. So we're seeing unhealthy foods subsidized very highly in many countries of the world. Horticulture, fruit and vegetable production has actually always been a bit of a Cinderella of the subsidy regime in most countries, including actually in the EU and in the UK. So there's a huge amount of room there to actually think about subsidizing healthy food as well, from the production to the consumption end. So just add that as well.
Thank you very much. I don't know, if anyone would like to jump on this point. Otherwise, I would have a question to Pedro and Elizabeth. We would like to know, are there areas where better data would enhance actors' ability to understand and track and prioritize their focus on inequality related to food security and nutrition related outcomes? We talk about real-time data, and I really want to deepen this point.
Well, once again, I mean, I think dependent on the context and the country, Latin America is very different from sub-Saharan Africa, so we really need to look at the context. But again, I think focusing again on the lowest quintiles of the population, the poorest, I think what is critical for any inequality reduction policy is to first of all, have a registry of who are the poor, so to understand where they are, who they are, and then also as a second step, try to understand better the dynamics that makes them extreme poor. What is the issue they're facing, and within that, nutrition is it a question of access, of availability, and others. So. And I think what is important is that we have to realize that the cost of building such a registry or that database at national level has been reduced enormously in the last few decades. So while in 20 years ago it will cost an enormous number of resources in terms of paperwork and staff and field surveys, today is much less costly. You can build such a registry at a relatively low cost by using geospatial location with GPS, tablets, having doing everything obviously on digital, having a centralized system by which you can collect data for different regions, municipalities, etc., giving a major role to other actors which are not necessarily in social protection, but could be municipalities that can reach out to people, and then eventually for particular campaigns, ask donors for support, but for specific campaigns and surveys. So I don't think that in any country right now it's so difficult and challenging to make these registries. You have very sophisticated ones like the ones in China, that despite all the many constraints of the authoritarian regime in China, it's true that they have a social registry, maybe for other purposes than just extreme poverty reduction. But I think that this is feasible, and I think that the first critical aspect is that we can through donor support, we can help build these registries, but they have to be sustainable in the medium term. Second element is that they have to be acknowledged as legitimate by the public opinion in that particular country. And for that, you need a number of elements. You need to ensure that the coverage is sufficient, so that really representative of the extreme poor area, not cover one particular region, ethnic group, political affiliation, or whatever. It has to be a full coverage. Therefore, the criteria to determine who enters in the registry and which category has to be transparent and known. There has to be a system of complaints, so that people who feel they have been excluded can go back and say, I should be in there, or my neighbor should not be in there, so somebody can judge whether this is legitimate or not. And then whatever mechanisms are used through the system also have to be transparent. I think transparency is critical for the systems to work. Also, because very easily a system of cash transfer can be used into a political machine to favor, a result in elections, or to favor one particular part of the Constituents against the other. My last message will be: don't be encouraged, discouraged if you think the task is too broad. I think the important thing is to start to build the system. Start by something small, maybe by a region, a municipality, a particular area. And if it works and if it's a good system, it will naturally grow through your support, other donor support, fiscal revenue from the government, and others. But you need to start somewhere. Don't try to do everything at the same time. Maybe you're in Nigeria and you think, okay, this is clearly beyond my means to get involved in that, or the government's means. You can start somewhere and then you can build gradually until you have full coverage. But I think this is important. Otherwise, I think the problem of policies that are trying to address a particular group tend to be very inefficient, untransparent, and very quickly lose credibility. So I would say, yes, you can. One thing that is very important is to have these registries. And then, as I said, you can, within this registry, you can look much more deeper into the issues of nutrition and food security, understand which are the driving factors. We have the UNICEF framework that we'll know, more sophisticated frameworks, but then these are global. We have to study case by case and region by region, understand the real needs and challenges of that particular population. That could be availability, affordability, and a mix of both, or other reasons.
Thank you very much for this detailed explanation regarding the registries, especially regarding your last message, not to discourage. I would say, faced with the difficulty and complexity of the system, all the multidimensional aspect of inequality, and also to have the courage to also consider the differences between the bottom 40% as a 10% richest percent of the population. It's always a real challenge that we are all face. So thank you so much. I don't know if Elizabeth, you would like also to jump in on this question. Otherwise, I would have other question for you.
Matilde, there is also a question in the chat.
Thank you, Elena.
I proceed?
Please, Elizabeth, and then we'll go to the question in the chat.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that particular question on data. I'm not really a data expert, but I'll try to bring in maybe the perspective of my own perspective as a smallholder farm, and how I view the importance of data. Really, we understand it's very critical. Data is really very important for transparency. It's very important for accountability purposes. We really need to have evidence. Evidence from the farmer's perspective on production. We have so many instances where we have, for example, even in the same district or same region, where there is a lot of food, but in the extreme end of that particular area, people are dying because of hunger. And at national level, the country is importing a lot of food, but when locally there is food that is available, but there is lack of data and information on food and the mechanism on how that food can be moved from one place to another. Also, when it comes to nutrition, the same thing. I think farmers really, or the population really needs to get information, understanding what is entailed when it comes to nutrition. I come from a district called Bushenyi in southwestern Uganda. And for those of you who know Uganda or who come from Uganda, Bushenyi is the food basket of the country. But also when you read on internet, it is a district that has the highest malnutrition levels. Not that there's no food, but because people don't understand maybe how food should be prepared and how it should be consumed. So this is where data really plays a very key role in understanding the food that is produced, but also the food that is supposed to be consumed, in what quantities and what nutritional value this kind of food provides. And I think that would be also a solution to really food security and nutrition. Thank you, and over.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for sharing your views and perspective. Very interesting. So there is one reflection also on the chat, so I will read it. It's more like a comment than a question. So from a participant, there might be. Sorry.
I think this one is from me. No, it's in the chat. Yeah.
No, in our space chat.
No, oh, sorry. Yeah, apologies.
Yes.
No,
sorry, two different chats. No, so there was also a comment on the on the house space, and I will read it. So there might be a strong need to work across sectors and across the humanitarian development and peace nexus in order to ensure that we strengthen resilience. And indeed, and I think this Inequality Week is exactly the representation of that, the need to not to work in a silo and to have distinguished agenda, sectors, etc., but also to take into consideration the interlinkages between the different sectors. And with inequality is even more crucial as is not only as it is the objective of the sectors at the EU. Maybe one last question, and then I will let the floor to Philippe Latriche in order to close this session on nutrition, food security through an inequality lens.
Mathilde, so a couple of those comments are from me. I just might add that to the response on data, if that's okay. But I think the problem is we do have an awful lot of food security and nutrition data there. So I've mentioned the food systems dashboard. That's a really good source of systems focused data, and I think Nadine made a really good point for viewing the food system as a system and understanding data from different parts of the system, including understanding the kind of sustainability and inequity links. But what we're starting to see in the global health world is a much more kind of disaggregated data on individual kind of health drivers, disaggregated on an equity basis. So I've put a really nice link there from the University of Pelotas in Brazil, who do that kind of work. And we seem to lack that in the food and nutrition world. The data that I used in my presentation on Nigeria, on kind of income inequalities, or the data that I showed there from Vietnam on differences in terms of ethnicity, we don't have reliable sources of these data. Sometimes they do exist there in DHS surveys, as in the Vietnam example, but all too often they don't, or this data isn't being exploited. So I think there needs to be a much more concerted effort to disaggregate food systems and nutrition data along these various axes of inequality and inequity. Over.
No, thank you very much, and thank you to you and Stella to have put also this link in the Ourspace platform so that the participant can review it during the rest of the week. And you anticipate a little bit the question I wanted to ask you, Nick, about what kind of insights can indicators on food security, quality of diet and nutrition provide with respect to trends in inequalities. I don't know if you want to add something on that.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, looking at the dietary data is really important because we're seeing a nutrition transition in most countries. In many countries where the EC delegations are based, I'm sure there's a kind of overarching focus on hunger and undernutrition, but even in those contexts, we're seeing increasing problems with overconsumption of unhealthy food as well. So the Global Obesity Report came out last week and showed that actually 9 out of the 10 countries where obesity and weight are going to be increasing over the next 20 years are in Africa and Asia. This is where obesity and overweight are going to be increasing the most. So we need to be tailoring our food system interventions already towards this problem of unhealthy diets in the fullest sense. So not just looking at undernutrition, but looking at the need for a healthy diet in the round as well. And the kinds of food system data that you'll see there on the food systems dashboard are really important for doing a diagnosis of this issue at a country level.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. I don't know if Leonard, you want to jump in to maybe close this this panel Q&A before I let the floor to Philippe.
Thank you, Mathilde. I will jump in on behalf of Leonard. I would like to thank all speakers for very thoughtful presentations and for also their work on nutrition, food security, and tackling inequalities. I would like to confirm that nutrition and food security as well, it's basically a multi-sector issues, and that it's not only receiving social protection, which is very much important, but also the access to public services, water and sanitation, education, health, of course, is very important, especially for the most vulnerable population, referring to children and women. And saying what also I could draw from presentation that nutrition is basically a marker of or nutrition indicators and food security indicators are markers of inequalities within the countries and across the countries. And enhancing nutrition and food security is also a powerful tool to address inequalities and actually to progress on many of the sustainable development goals. So thank you for this participation to the audience and to the speakers.
And also thank you to you, Elena. And thank you to Elena also to have organized this session with such great speakers. And also thank you so much to all the guest speakers. As Elena says, it was very interesting and fascinating presentation. And to conclude, I will let the floor to Philippe Latriche, advisor on inequalities to the DG. Philippe, the floor is yours.
Merci, Mathilde. Thanks to you for really running a fantastic week across all areas of intervention. And thanks again. I don't want to add to what Elena also just said, because I could also certainly not only thank all the speakers, but certainly all the colleagues across the world and in headquarters working on this issue. So maybe just very briefly thanks really for all the work. Just very briefly from my end, a few buzzwords that I heard this afternoon, and then maybe one last point on the political relevance of your work also. I mean, connecting the dots, I think, goes across what you're doing. I mean, specifically in food and security, but across all the discussions you're having this week. I mean, we're discussing here food security and nutrition, but you cannot disconnect this from fiscal policy discussions yesterday, water discussion, gender, human rights, health approach, digital, and other issues. It is about policy first, and you've all said so in different ways. This is about food systems, this is about the drivers of, but this is also, as reflected by also what Pedro presented, about concrete programs and concrete actions, whether they're budget support operations or taking other forms. It is complex. I mean, tackling inequality is a challenging and difficult issue, but it's certainly one where we are we're right to be involved and to try to make a difference. It's about the multi-dimension. Not need for me to repeat. It's about being inclusive, and I think the work of presented by CFS in building in civil society organization, but also private sectors at large is key. And also the work around data that you just exchanged. So challenging, yes, but also one where really cuts across rich and poor countries alike. And that would be my last point, and trying to connect it also to some of the work that the Commissioner and the Commission is pushing at this stage is really of key political relevance. And when we need, because it does make sense, especially in the current geopolitical context, to continue pushing this agenda forward. The Commissioner, by the way, I think Mathilde, the Commissioner was there yesterday, as you know, also opening an event organized by Concord here in Brussels, the Equality Day, organized by civil society organization. And I was thinking, when I was just listening to the various interventions, that Mathilde, we could actually maybe share on the platform the speech that the Commissioner delivered at the beginning of the Equality Day organized yesterday morning. I think that would be also relevant, because as you know, I mean, your work in HQ and in delegation is of political relevance and key importance for Commissioner Urpilainen. I mean, it's front and center of everything that she's trying to promote. So clearly a political relevance to what we're doing in INPA, but also what the Commissioner is pushing. But I think this is also key in terms of relevance for the political European agenda and international agenda. Elena, you just mentioned the SDGs, as you know, and to connect the dots again between what we do on inequalities and the broader work that the Commission is actually promoting right now. We are currently preparing, led by the Cabinet of the President von der Leyen and the Secretary General, the first EU voluntary review on SDGs that we will be presenting in July at the high-level political forum in New York. And obviously, your work fits into this European effort to concretely showcase what are the connections, not only in what we do externally, to go back to some of the discussions you've been having in the panel about policy coherence and what we do in other policies, not only those that are led by DG international partnerships, to connect the dots also here and make the connections between all EU policies and this Agenda 2030 SDG agenda that we continue to promote. So the work on inequality, connecting the dots, also feeds into the EU voluntary review that we will be presenting in July. And I think, again, to connect the dot, because there's no, it's not like we're working in inequalities and there's somebody else working on SDGs and then somebody else working on Global Gateway, where we're trying also, going back to some of the presentations that Leonard made on working on specific filière, or what Pedro was also saying in terms of trying to find where we have the biggest impact on the ground, is also Global Gateway. So the work on inequality needs also to fit into this European endeavor to focus on key areas in partnership with countries, as I think Elizabeth put it very rightly, and try to come with firepower in the sense of our means, not only at EU level, but also member states, as Team Europe, member states, financial institutions, and the private sector. So for me, the message that I would like to share is of key political relevance. I mean, your efforts fit not only in what we're doing in terms of inequalities and fighting inequalities, but in the broader framework of our push towards the 2030 agenda and SDGs, with the presentations in July and September in New York, and more broadly with our Global Gateway approach in terms of focus and impact of what we're trying to do in partnership with third countries. So thank you to all, actually. Thank you all for the work, because what we're doing in this specific area resonates politically at those various levels. So thanks to you, Mathilde, and thanks to all of you.
Thank you very much, Philippe. Thank you very much for this clothing. And thank you again. Thank you for joining this this session on nutrition, food security, and equality. And I wish you a great day.